तथाज प्रतिबोधितां भगवता नारायणेन स्वयं व्यासेन ग्रथितां पुराणमुनिना मध्ये महाभारतम्।
ॐ असतो मा सद्गमय तमसो मा ज्योतिर्गमय मृत्योर्मा अमृतं गमय आविराविर्महेति रुद्रयत्ते दक्षिणं मुखं तेन मां पाहि नित्यम्. May the divine lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May the divine consciousness fill our hearts and protect us. Today we will take a look at some of the important themes that occur in chapter 7. We know that every chapter has a name. The name of the chapter 7 is called Jnana Vijnana Yoga. Now the word Jnana is generally translated as knowledge, but sometimes also as consciousness. And we know by the study of Vedanta that knowledge itself can be of many kinds. There is, to begin with, theoretical knowledge, and then there is the experiential knowledge. Sri Ramakrishna used to say that some people know about milk by hearing about it, or we can know a little bit more about milk by reading about it. But then the knowledge that we get by actually drinking a glass of milk is more profound, more deep than merely reading about something, or reading about a place, or actually going there and living there. So both of these are knowledge. So the first one is sometimes called indirect knowledge, and the second one is direct knowledge. Now all of these connotations of knowledge are comprised in that word jnana. In fact, yesterday I was speaking with a group, and one of the topics that did come up was about the usefulness of translation, but also the limitations of translation. That when we try to translate a word from one language to another, what a translator tries to do is to find a word that best conveys the sense of the original term. Now, there are really no words which are exact meanings into different languages, because a lot of these words have a history. For instance, the word jnana in Sanskrit has a history of its own. The word knowledge in English has a history of its own. And so when we then try to equate the Sanskrit jnana with English knowledge, all the history attached to the word in that language also comes along with it, and may not always accurately convey the original term. It might add some nuance to it, or remove some nuance through it, or express some ambiguity about the original meaning. So all these complications can occur. And that is why, especially when we study scriptural texts, ancient scriptural texts, and most of us tend to study them in translations, we have to then not depend exclusively on translations, because we have seen even the Gita, if you have one translation done by somebody and you take up, maybe test out 2 or 3 other translations, you'll find they are not exactly identical. And then the question would be, well, which of these is conveying the meaning of the original in the most accurate way? And what often helps is reflecting on the meaning of the verse, reading commentaries on it. So when the word that is translated gets fleshed out through explanations, the meaning becomes a little bit more clear. And therefore, the context also is important. Now, I'm saying all this because the word vijnana is also knowledge. Essentially, it's a word jnana with the prefix vi, vishesha rupena jnanam, a special kind of knowledge. But it's still knowledge. The word jnana and vijnana, jnana is common in both. So we could say that if the word vijnana were to appear in isolation somewhere, we could translate it as knowledge. If the word jnana were to come in isolation, it said knowledge. Now, when they come together, jnana, vijnana, yoga, then you have to find some nuance between the two, some difference between the two, some distinction between the two. And so one way of understanding when these words come together, one way of understanding the difference between them is jnana is knowledge and vijnana, which means vishesha jnana, a special, intimate kind of knowledge. And so this yoga could therefore be translated as both theoretical knowledge and experiential knowledge, or getting to know something intellectually and then getting to experience it as well. So that is how this chapter 7 begins, by Krishna telling Arjuna that I will now give you both jnana and vijnana, not only the theoretical understanding of something, but also help you to know how you can actually experience the truth of that thing. So that is how the verse begins. The third verse is very interesting, very important, and statistically could be even a little bit discouraging if we are not brave enough, if we are not courageous enough. So the third verse goes like this. Manushyanam sahasreshu kaschit yatati siddhaye yatatam api siddhanam kaschin mam vetti tattvataha. One perhaps in thousands of people strives for perfection, and one perhaps among those blessed ones striving thus knows me in reality. So here is this one question that can often come. What chance do I have in getting enlightened? Statistically, how much chance do I have? In the last few days, we have had a lot of talk about polling and data. So what does the past data suggest about people who have striven hard for spiritual enlightenment, and how many have actually become enlightened? So this is a rather broad statement about the probability involved. And it says that among thousands, and considering the population of the world today, we might add among millions, perhaps a few, some may even think of investing some or all of their time and energy in attaining spiritual enlightenment. And we can see that while by and large people tend to be religious, even when they don't identify themselves as religious, there is some corner of the heart, many people do believe that there is something more to life than what meets the eye. Although many people may not admit it or may not themselves be aware of that space in their own being which acknowledges the present. So there will be, I think if you start polling it, a lot more people might like to say they are indifferent or secular rather than religious. It's a little bit like people who want to when you're filling your census form, and if you are asked whether you want to register as a Democrat or a Republican, some people, they are very clear about their identity, and they might put a D or a R there. Some might put it as unregistered or independence. Now, all those who put themselves as independents doesn't mean that they don't have a leaning toward one or the other of the two, but they wouldn't want to identify themselves as such. Same is true about people who think they are religious and people who say they are not. I would hazard the guess that many people who don't identify themselves as religious have a space in their heart somewhere where the religious and spiritual ideals are acknowledged, are accepted, but one doesn't want to affirm that for whatever reason. It just remains in some corner of the heart, and one may like to think of oneself as, oh, I don't believe in all that. I'm a very secular person. But that's not really the main point that I wanted to emphasize. The idea is that even in the world that we live in, we know that while many may be religious, people who take spiritual life seriously are relatively very few. People who have a daily practice, whether it's of prayer or study or meditation, and who do it regularly without fail, such numbers are very small. And so Krishna says here that among hundreds and millions, perhaps one or two or maybe few even strive for enlightenment. And among those who strive for enlightenment, so first of all, your number gets reduced considerably by the people who strive for enlightenment. And among those who strive for enlightenment, perhaps one or two may become enlightened. Now, that's not a very encouraging statistic. And some of us might feel, what chance have I? The Vedic sages and some of these great mystics we read about, they prayed so often and so long. They meditated, they studied, they reflected on these things. And compared to what they did, what chance my praying for a few minutes in the morning and a few minutes in the evening, what chance have I? So it's easy to feel discouraged. And discouragement can lead to the idea, what's the point? So rather than waste these few minutes which will not take me anywhere in spiritual life, nowhere near enlightenment, I'd better do something else which might be more productive. That could be one reaction from some people. But then, some other people, again, very few, will say, even if it's some rare person who gets enlightened, why can't I be that rare person? Why can't I be the one? And we know for a long time, and every year, there are these expeditions, mountaineering expeditions. So, say to the Mount Everest, which is the tallest peak in the world. Not everyone who goes succeeds in scaling the peak. But that doesn't stop people from trying. And if you keep on trying, one day you will. We know only one person can become the president. But that doesn't stop many people from thinking about it, dreaming about it, and running for election. And if you don't become successful right away, maybe after 30 years, after 2 or 3 attempts, you could be. So, if we don't give up, if we don't get discouraged, success will come. And that is why the word for sincere spiritual seekers in the text is often dhira. Now, the word dhira can be understood again in many different ways. There is the word dhi, which is part of buddhi. So, one who is that sharp and clear power of understanding, one endowed with such a power of understanding. But the word dhira in Sanskrit, the more common way of understanding that word is one who is brave, one who is courageous. In fact, the Upanishad says, Nayam Atma Balahinena Labhyaha. Na Ayam Atma. This Atman Balahinena Na Labhyaha. Bala means strength. Balahina means one who is without strength. So, Labhyaha, attained. So this Atman, the spirit, cannot be attained by one who is without strength. And that strength is not the strength of the muscles or the biceps. That strength is the inner strength. That is where this courage, that grit, that determination comes. So even if it is said that maybe among millions, maybe one person will succeed in attaining the highest, a brave and a true spiritual seeker says, I will be that one person. So no matter how often I fail, no matter how often I feel that I won't be able to do it, I'm not going to give in to such negativities. Rise up after every fall and start marching. And to such a person, success will come. There is this one very often quoted Sanskrit verse which says that success can come only through striving, only through struggle, only by not giving up. Success cannot come merely through daydreaming. Udyamena hi siddhyanti. Udyama means with striving, struggle. So all the dreams can be fulfilled only with real hard work and struggle. And then the second line of that verse says, Nahi suptasya simhasya pravishanti mukhe. Nahi suptasya simhasya pravishanti mukhe mrugaha. I may have gotten an interchange of word here and there. So it means that in the mouth of a sleeping lion, animals are not, or deers are not going to go and offer themselves in the mouth of a sleeping lion. If a lion wants to hunt a deer and eat it, the lion has to work for it. And the lion may not always succeed, but they don't stop trying because there is a hunger. Hunger will make them run and catch their prey and eat it. The important question is how hungry we are, how hungry for God we are, how hungry for enlightenment we are. So oftentimes when we don't strive hard enough or when we give up easily, one of the major reasons why we do that is that we are not hungry enough. If there is that real hunger, then we will not give up very easily. That's the idea. So that's what Krishna is pointing out to Arjuna here. The reason is that here, I'm here by your side. I'm happy to give you this both jnana and vijnana. And this knowledge is so precious, so valuable, that if you don't make good use of it, you are really going to miss something which is extremely precious. Because this is so precious that one perchance in million would even want it. And among those who want it, among the millions who want it, only one may succeed in attaining it. And so that's how Krishna begins this chapter. Let's look at the next three verses, 4, 5, and 6. Bhumirapo nalo vayuhu kham mano buddhirev cha ahankaram iti yamme bhinna prakritirashtadha apareyamitastvanyam prakritim vidhi me param jiva bhutam mahabaho yayedam dharyate jagat etadionini bhutani sarvani tyupadharaya aham kritsnasya jagatah prabhava pralayastatha. Bhumi, earth; up, water; anala, fire; vayu, air; kha, ether; mind, intellect, and egoism. Thus is my Prakriti divided eightfold. This is the lower Prakriti. But different from it, know thou, O mighty armed, my higher Prakriti, the principle of self-consciousness by which this universe is sustained. Know that those two Prakritis are the womb of all beings. I am the origin and dissolution of the whole universe. This is a very interesting set of verses. Krishna is pointing out here what he says are two Prakritis. In a very broad way, we could say two aspects or two natures. Again, Prakriti is one other word. It's not very easy to find just a one-word translation into English. And therefore, in this translation, they have simply kept the word Prakriti. So, Krishna says the first, the lower Prakriti, the lower manifestation of that reality, he says is eightfold. He says it's earth, water, fire. You can see the first 5 of these 8 are what are often known as the 5 primal elements. And I think this will be a good time to understand how Vedanta explains or how Vedanta describes the material universe in which we live. How did matter, or what was the origin of matter? How did it evolve? And how did all of this, including our own body and mind, where do they all fit into this material scheme? And behind all of this, as Krishna says in verse 5, is the higher nature, which is pure consciousness. So there are these two entities. There is consciousness on one side and the material universe, matter on the other. In Sanskrit, consciousness is sometimes called Chit or Chaitanya, and matter or material is called Jada. So there is this material world, Jada Prakriti, and then there is the Chit, Chaitanya. So everything that we encounter today is a combination of consciousness and material thing. And we can look at that in our own lives, in our own personalities. So every one of us, the way we understand ourselves, there is a material component to our being, the body which, when I say I am sitting here, I'm really saying this is me. But this that I'm pointing to now is actually a part of this world. The body is a part of this world. We know the chemical composition of our body. We know that it is made up of atoms and molecules. We know that after death, as dust returns to dust, it'll just merge into this part, become a part of this material world. Whether you cremate it or you bury it, it is going to disintegrate and into its elemental particles. So the body is a part of the material world. The Gita says the mind is also a part of the material world. So the mind and the body, and this includes the what he calls here as in that 8 in verse 4, mind, intellect, and egoism. These are all different functions of the mind. So essentially, I'm just calling them collectively as mind. So the mind is also a part of the material world. The body is also a part of the material world. And besides the body and mind, what every one of us has is consciousness. The body appears conscious, the mind appears conscious, but the consciousness in the body and mind does not belong to the body and mind. So consciousness is different, but it is so strong, it's so powerful that even with the body mind covering over it, it is able to percolate through the body and mind. It's like a powerful bulb that you have, and even if you put a lamp shade over it, the light will percolate through that shade. So similarly, the light of consciousness, which is coming from the self, the spirit, the Atman, the body and mind are like these lamp shades. But that light of consciousness is so strong that we are able to experience it even through the body and mind. Now it's by mistake that we think that the body is conscious, the mind is conscious. The consciousness doesn't belong to it. How do we know that? Well, simply this. When a person dies, the body doesn't disappear. There is the corpse, there is the dead body. Now, if consciousness belonged to the body, then you could not have separated it from the body. But we know that a person's body would be just lying prostrate after death, and it is not conscious at all. I think that we don't need any more evidence to show that consciousness is not inseparable from the body, because if it were, the way we see death, it wouldn't have occurred that way. And so therefore, consciousness is seen in the Gita as an independent, the only independent entity. Both the body and mind are mutually dependent and dependent on the material world as well. So let's look at how these first 5 elements that are described here, how that whole scheme works. I think it will be helpful if we see it in a form of a chart. So I have the chart in my computer, and you will be able to see it on your screen as well. So as you can see, there is a small chart I had made many years ago when I gave a class on Panchadashi. And so I have copied that chart from that class that I gave. And so here it is before you. So you can see the 5 elements, the primary elements mentioned on the left-hand side: space, air, light, water, and earth. Light is sometimes referred to as fire in some texts as well. Now, these words that are used to refer to these primary elements are words that we use in common language as well. So we have some idea of what space means: air, light, water. So it's important to remember that these words don't refer to what we are seeing. So this air is not the air that we are seeing now. This light or fire is not the light and fire we are. So what do these words stand for? So these words stand for, you'll see the word space. In many old English translations of a previous generation or a generation prior to that, the word space was often, the word akasha in Sanskrit was often translated as ether. And maybe if you have a very old translation, you might find some people translating it as ether. But a better and a more accurate translation of the word akasha is space. So what the Upanishad says, the Taittiriya Upanishad, begins this way, that there was only this one reality, the Atman, the self, that alone existed. the first change, or first transformation, or the first thing to emerge from the Atman was space. Now, how, of course, something that we have seen many occasions before, but nevertheless, good to remind ourselves, we could say, how can anything emerge from the Atman? The Atman is not some kind of a bag that, whoa, space comes out and this comes out. It isn't like that. So, Atman is one, undivided, unchanging. Nothing can come from Atman. And yet, we say, well, this is coming from the Atman. So what does it mean? If nothing can come out of the Atman and something seems to have come out of the Atman, the only way that can happen is if it has not really happened. If it is only an apparition, it's only an imagination. And we might say, well, is it possible for something to be seemed to have happening while not really happening? And that is why I often go to the example of a dream. Now, in the dream, something seems to be happening, because that's why when we dream at night, we go here and there. But has it really happened? No. So it's possible that something may not happen really, and yet may seem to have happened. So that's how the Upanishads describe it. The Atman is always non-dual. The Atman is always infinite, always unchanging, always without any kind of a transformation. And therefore nothing can change it. And yet something seems to have changed it. And that's why it always begins with ignorance. When the Atman forgets that it is unchangeable, then it seems to change. And the first change that occurs is the appearance of space, or akasha in Sanskrit. Now, the Upanishad says, Tasmadvai Atmanaha Akasha Sambhutaha. The first Akasha came. Then Akashat Vayuhu. So from space, Vayu or air emerged. Vayor Agnihi. From that light of fire emerged. Agner Apaha. So from fire or light, water emerged. And Adbhyav Prithivi. And from water, the earth. Again, the earth is not the name of a planet. It's just the solid element. So what are these words again? Now, the colors are just random. It isn't like that this is just for visual understanding. Now, each of these elements is associated with a certain quality or a certain sense experience. So the quality of space is sound. The quality of air is touch. The quality of light is sight. The quality of water is taste. The quality of earth is smell. There is a school of philosophy in the Indian subcontinent, and that is called Nyaya. Now they have done a deep study and exploration of this way of thinking, and so they go much deeper into why space is connected with sound, why air is connected with touch. But we don't need to go into those technicalities now. It's enough in a general way, just for our own remembrance. We could say, of course, we know that sound does travel. Even if people are separated from one another, the sound travels through space. Air, if there is a breeze, we can feel the touch, the breeze, the wind. Light, of course, clear, connected with sight. Water, with taste. And how is the earth connected with smell? And then these old texts say that you get an idea of it the first rain of the season. Now, we don't have a dedicated rainy season here, but in many tropical countries, after a fierce summer, when the monsoons arrive and the rain first falls, and you go out for a walk, you get a kind of a very earthy fragrance just from the soil. Sometimes we do it here as well. We just go out after a dry spell for a long time, and then you have some showers, and you can go out into the garden, and you just get that fragrance. So these are some of the ways in those old texts, and this is not the only, and this is a very simple way that I have tried to express to you, but they go into details about why each of these qualities is associated with each of these elements. But take a look at that chart once again. So first thing to appear, you just find a one rectangle there, that is space. Now space is not this space what comes before our mind when we say space. Space here, or akasha, means the potentiality of this quality of sound. So that which makes it possible for the sound to be transmitted, a sound to be heard, a sound to be received, that potentiality is the first element. And you can understand that just because it's a potentiality, it's very subtle. It's very subtle. And so subtle that you can't even think about it through your mind. So space here in this diagram is only a potentiality for sound. Then from space, Vayu, or air, emerged. There is a big discussion in the books about what is the relationship between cause and effect. And it's a philosophical subject in its own right. Is the effect different from the cause, or is it same as the cause? If the effect and the cause are completely independent and different, then why call them cause and effect? So there has to be some relationship. We cannot say that the cause and effect are one and the same. Then why call them by two different names? And so sometimes Swami Vivekananda in his works has sometimes expressed it this way. He says the effect is nothing but a cause in another form. So we could say something of the cause is transmitted into the effect. The effect may have an identity of its own, but it also carries something from the cause. And in some ways we can understand that every baby carries something from the parents. There are certain hereditary characteristics that get transmitted from the source to the one that comes after it. But that doesn't mean the child is completely identical with the parent. The child will have some characteristic, some quality of their own, in addition to certain things inherited from the parents. So think about it this way here. So let's say the air is a child of space. So it inherits the quality of sound, and in addition, it has the quality of touch. So the air has a potentiality of touch, which is its own, and the inherited potentiality for sound from its parent space. So you can see as you go down that table, you will see that light has its own quality of sight in addition to the two qualities inherited from its parent and grandparent. Water will have taste in addition to the three qualities before. Earth, the quality of smell in addition to these four qualities before. So look upon these 5 elements. The first 5 of the 8 ingredients that Krishna refers to as the lower nature, lower prakriti. So the first 5 are these potentialities for these different kinds of sense experiences. I would like to show you now another chart which will give you a little bit wider focus. Now we know that everything in this world is filled with three gunas. And all of you are familiar, the sattva, rajas and tamas. So the scheme that the Gita and other Vedanta texts present us, it shows us how our different sense organs, the organs of knowledge, the senses of knowledge and the senses of action. In Sanskrit they are called jnanendriya. Indriya means sense. So jnana indriya, the senses of knowledge, karma indriya, the senses of action. Now everything has come from these primary elements. But how have they come? So in this chapter will give you some idea about how the scheme is presented in Vedanta texts. So again, look at the left hand side. So you have space, air, fire, water, earth. Now the senses of knowledge that we have, each of these senses of knowledge have come from the sattvic portion, the sattva part, the sattvic part of every one of these elements has produced the different senses. So the sattva part of akasha or space produces my sense of hearing. The sattva part of vayu or air produces my sense of touch. The sattva part of fire produces my sense of sight. The sattva part of water produces my sense of taste. And the sattva part of earth produces my sense of smell. So the senses of knowledge appear in our personality. The constitution, the constituents of the senses of knowledge are the sattva portions of these primal elements. Now what about the mind, which is sometimes called the inner instrument? Antah karana. Antah means inner, karana is an instrument. So antah karana is the inner instrument. Now the mind is made up of all the five, the sattvic portion of all the five elements taken together forms the mind. And it's understandable why and how, because the mind is where all of these sense information, the sensory data gets coordinated. And so it will need the input from all different elements. While the different senses, they have a more specific duty. So our eyes can see, but our eyes cannot hear. Our taste, we can taste through with our tongue, but we cannot see with our tongue. And so on. So each of the senses is doing a very specific task. The mind is kind of like the hub, the coordinating. All the sensory data is finally brought to the mind and the intellect for processing. And so the mind and the intellect is made up of the sattvic elements of all the five primary elements. Now coming to the rajas, the rajasic part of the five elements, again exactly in the same way, each of these primary elements produces or it constitutes each of the five senses of action. So the sense of speech comes from space, hands, feet, excretion, reproduction. And you can see the correlation between it. Because the sense of speech comes from space, which is also gives hearing, that's why speech and hearing are connected, and so on. Again, this is just a very broad outline. And then life force is prana. So the prana that we have, the vital forces within us, sometimes they are subdivided according to the functions they have into prana, apana, samana, udana, and vyana. So these vital forces, these pranas, collectively they are simply called prana. They are formed through all of the elements and their rajasic parts. So rajasic parts of all the elements taken together form prana. The sattvic portions of all the 5 elements taken together form the mind. Each of these elements taken individually, they form the senses of action and the senses of knowledge. And the tamasic part of all these elements taken together forms the gross body. Now, what is this tamasic part? How is this thing? So what happens is that each of these elements gets mixed up with every other element and makes from there, from the subtle, it becomes a little bit more tangible. And this whole process is called in Sanskrit Panchikaranam. And Panchikaranam, what they do is it's kind of a mathematical thing. Very briefly, let me put it simply this way, that if the gross element is considered to be 100 cents, so let's say 100 cents. Now 100 cent, a gross form of space will have 50%, 50 cents of the subtle space, and the remaining 50 cents are divided into the other 4. So if you go look at 100% of gross space, will have 50% of space and 12.5% of the other 4. Similarly with air and fire and water. So this is how the books explain the subtle becomes gross. And then this gross will, through atoms and molecules, will become even more gross by all these permutations and combination, and then we have the material universe. One question can be, how do we know that all this happens? And the answer is, we don't know. A better answer is, it never happened. And because it never happened, you can cook up any story you want. It's like children's books. If you have fairy tales, you can cook up. I mean, very recently, I had never seen Star Wars before. I'd kind of heard about it, seen a few clips here and there, but never really seen it systematically. It wasn't something available when I was growing up back in India. Anyway, recently I got to see it, and it's amazing. Of course, clearly, I'm sure many of you are fans of Star Wars, at least people of a certain generation. What was interesting in that is, you have all these different kinds of creatures. I mean, there are human beings, of course, there. But besides human beings, there are lots of other creatures. And some amazing appearances with eyes somewhere. And you know, now we could say, how do they know that those creatures were like that? And the answer is, they don't know. And what does it even matter? Did all these wars really happen on some different galaxies? No. How do we know? And yet, we can enjoy it. We can talk about it. We can discuss it. Maybe we can learn a few lessons from it. The Upanishads describe this way of division, but they have not made it into a dogma. They are not saying, this is exactly how it happened, and just believe in it. What they are saying is, this is one way of understanding it. If for whatever reason you don't like it, that's fine. You create your own scheme, because ultimately it never really happened. But just to go back to the way it is described, so the process called Panchikarana, these 5 elements then, which begin with just the potentialities, of these different sense experiences, through all of these processes of combination, ultimately become tangible. And then through that, all of this material universe has emerged. So that's been a lot today. So what we will do is we will take a short break now, about 5 minutes. Take a look at this chart. See if you have any thoughts or ideas or questions, and then we will take a look at it after 5 minutes. Okay. Om Jananim Saratam Devim Ramakrishnam Jagadgurum Padapadme Tayo Shritva Pranamami Muhurmuhu. So let's take a look at the questions. At any given time, few die, but eventually everyone is destined to die. Similarly, at any given time, few attain enlightenment, but eventually everyone is destined to be free. Any merit to this? Sure, it's possible to say that eventually everyone will become free. And if one might say, then why should I? What's the hurry? And really, there is no hurry in some sense. Again, as I said, eventually everyone will get to eat. And those who are hungry, very hungry, would want to eat first. Those who don't feel that hunger can wait. And then they can eat when they feel hungry. So enlightenment is a little bit like that. If we don't feel the urgency to attain freedom from this transmigratory existence, we can wait. We can do other things. Having said that, it's also important to remember that it's often called a samsara chakra. A samsara chakra means the circle of transmigratory existence. And a circle clearly has no beginning and no end. So although we can say eventually everyone will attain enlightenment, it's also possible to see that enlightenment cannot occur if I keep on moving into the circle. The circle will not on its own break apart. At some point, I need to feel the need to get out of that vicious circle of transmigratory existence, of samsara. So, everyone will eventually become free, can be understood not in the sense that it will happen automatically without any initiative on my part. It can be understood in the sense that if I don't feel hungry now, eventually at some point in the future, I will, and then I will become free. And then there is a third way to look at it, and that would be, what everyone? Which everyone? There is just the Atman. There is no everyone. It's a little bit like asking then, when I wake up in the morning and my dream ends, will everyone else I met in my dream, when will they wake up? And you could say, well, eventually all the people I met in my dream will also wake up. Or you could say, there was nobody else. I was the only one there. And so from that perspective, there is no everyone. There is just me, the ignorant, deluded me who is sleeping and dreaming all this. And eventually, if and when I get out of my dream, even if and when I wake up, then the dream will end. The dream will not end until I wake up. And I won't wake up until I'm enjoying this dream. I won't wake up until I feel I need to get out of this dream. Because if I'm enjoying it, why would I want to get up? And so, again, there is a limit to how far you can take this analogy, because we might say none of us can sleep indefinitely. So the dream analogy is given to convey a certain point. If you stretch it too far, then it won't work. Why does Krishna mention this remote chance of enlightenment to Arjuna, especially since it's so discouraging? Is there a purpose here? One thing to remember, that Arjuna here is only an excuse in some ways, in the sense that Krishna is passing this knowledge and insight to all of us, not only to Arjuna who was there right in front of him. So through Arjuna, he is really addressing the generations of spiritual seekers, including you and me, that this is something very precious. This is something that will free me from all problems forever. Not just the problem at this Kurukshetra war, but the problems permanently. But it is something that is so precious that I need to pay special attention to it. I need to listen to it very carefully. So it should not be discouraging. It is not meant to discourage, but I mean, I can understand some people will get discouraged, but I don't think that was the intention behind Krishna. The intention was, this is really very rare, very precious. I wouldn't call it marketing. I mean, that kind of sounds very, very kind of gross. But sometimes that's what they do. I mean, if you have listened to any of the Apple keynotes or the product announcements that they do, they'll say, this is the best thing that's available. And when you make such claims like that, people say, oh, then this is something I need to have. So this is not exactly in the same category, obviously, but the idea is, once you know that this is so rare, so precious, so difficult, that unless you pay attention to it carefully, unless you give yourself fully to it, the chances of success could be very less. So this is not for the weak-hearted. This is not for people who are into it just as a form of in India, there's one phrase that gets often used. Well, when I say in India, it's just the India that I grew up in. I don't know. I mean, societies change, people change, things change, language changes. So I'm not really speaking for how things are right now. But the times I grew up in, one of the phrases that was often used was, and I think it's a typical part of the Indian English, they'll say time pass. That is, you're doing something with not any particular specific motive other than, I just want to while away my time. And so they simply used to say time pass in many Indian languages. And so if somebody is taking up spiritual life, a study of the Gita is, oh, I have nothing better to do, just it's kind of good. Everybody said read the Gita, so I'm reading the Gita. It's not going to work. Well, I mean, you'll get some benefit clearly. It's not that it's totally useless, but if I want to really benefit from the teaching, then I need to recognize how rare and precious that is. I think that is more the intent than discouraging anyone. I mean, why would Krishna want anybody to discourage us? I mean, that's how I see it. Yeah. Next question. Does the jnana lead to vijnana, or are they two separate types of realization that are connected to each other? They are connected to each other. So here, jnana and vijnana, because they come together, jnana can be understood as indirect knowledge. And an indirect knowledge can come through study of books, through listening to lectures, through discussion with friends. It's a conceptual knowledge, a knowledge that helps clarify our intellectual understanding. And vijnana is actually experiencing the truth. So jnana will be the Atman is infinite. The Atman is birthless and deathless. Knowing that. and that Atman is my real identity. Reading about it in the Gita is jnana. But then, as a result of my spiritual practices, I actually see not that Atman as some entity which is birthless and deathless, but I actually experience I am birthless and deathless. I am infinite. I am not limited to this body and mind. When I experience that as strongly as I experience my human identity now, then that is Vijnana. So they are connected. But that connection is not essential. I say that because it's not necessary that everyone has to study the Gita and the Upanishad first, understand it intellectually first, and then realize it. There are many who didn't read any of these things. But they were ready for that. They just heard the teacher tell them, and then they became enlightened. And oftentimes when such a thing happens, we often say, well, that was God's grace. So, what role intellectual understanding plays in spiritual life? What role scriptural study plays in spiritual life is not very easy to say. We cannot say it is absolutely necessary. We cannot say it is useless either, because those of us who have made such a study know that it does help answer many of our questions, remove many of our doubts. May not answer every question, but it answers many questions. So it is helpful, and done in a proper way and followed up with a practice, we could say that the two are connected, but not in the sense that it is absolutely necessary. This external evolution would map nicely with understanding of evolution of the external world in modern physics. The empty space, the Higgs field was first alone, came hydrogen atoms, and then the gravity and collapsed and ignited. We got stars. As stars exploded, we got materials of periodic table as liquid. As these cooled and solidified, we got solids composing asteroids and planets and so on. That's great. I'm so happy. I'm not studied this modern physics very deeply. I have just a little bit of a very preliminary knowledge about it. If the modern science agrees with the general scheme that is presented in the Gita and the Upanishads, so much the better for modern science. Then they can say, well, there is one more evidence that what we are trying to prove through our experiments and through these very sophisticated instruments in the laboratories was something that finds an echo even in these very ancient teachings. So that's excellent. That's wonderful. Isn't the translation of Akasha space problematic, since sound is considered a property of Akasha but cannot travel through the vacuum of space? Again, as I said, when I say space, don't conflate it with the space as we understand it now. So the Akasha here is not the space that you are referring to. Akasha here is only the potentiality where sound can manifest, where the sound can be sent and a sound can be received. So don't mix it up with the space of the material world. Krishna says that he will reveal Vijnana to Arjuna, but can anyone reveal Vijnana to another? Must it not come from direct experience and self-realization? Absolutely, you are right. So what Krishna is saying here, we can understand it, that it's not that he is going to reveal it, he is going to show Arjuna what he must do so that it will be revealed to him. One of the questions that Vivekananda, as a young man, when he went to Ramakrishna and asked him the question that he was asking many spiritual leaders of his time in the city where he lived. And that question was, have you seen God? And Ramakrishna's answer now has become well known to students of Vivekananda's life. when Ramakrishna was asked, "Have you seen God?" and his answer was a very definitive yes. I have seen, and you can see him as well. And that is what is important. The second sentence is very important. You can see him as well. Sometimes people misquote those words, and then they say, Ramakrishna said, I have seen and I can show him to you as well. But that's not really what he said. He said that I have seen and you can see him also. So it's a very good question and comment. Yes, that Vijnana cannot be given, but the way to attain Vijnana can be shown. And if that way is practiced sincerely by the student, then that student will have a direct experience. Is enlightenment born of dharma in the same way as the subtle manifests into the gross? Is dharma the cause of enlightenment? Dharma is a fairly advanced step towards enlightenment. In the Upanishad called the Katha Upanishad, one of the questions that comes is that what is that truth which is beyond dharma and beyond adharma? So, dharma is the world in which we live is a polarized world. Well, we see that in the political context as well, but in a larger philosophical way, the world is polarized. So everything has its counterpart. If there is light, there is darkness. If there is love, there is hatred. If there is something right, then there is something wrong. There is good, there is evil, and so on. So in that sense, there are all these polarities are present. And so dharma has its counterpart called adharma. So we need to hold on to the path of dharma. So if I have to be enlightened, then adharma, the opposite of dharma, has to completely get out of my life. I cannot have adharma and be enlightened. It doesn't work that way. So I must strive to eliminate all adharma, eliminate all falsehood, dishonesty, everything that is negative, and have only dharma remaining. And dharma is a quality of sattva. So when dharma remains in our life, dharma has the ability to help us transcend itself. So dharma is not the same as enlightenment, but dharma can lead me to enlightenment. Has this, we have to go beyond dharma to be enlightened, but the self-destruct button for dharma is embedded in dharma. But first I need to eliminate adharma, hold on to dharma, and then dharma shows me the way to go beyond it and become enlightened. Do inhalation and exhalation of breath relate to prana in that chart? Does it imply that pranayama can control the life force? Yes, I mean pranayama is actually a control of prana. So by the word pranayama itself means controlling prana. What we must recognize is that pranayama, in practice, we try to regulate our breath and control our breath. The breath itself is not prana. The breath is one of the manifestations of prana. Prana itself is very subtle, as we saw. It's made from the rajasic elements of these subtle primal elements. So prana itself is very subtle. Compared to the gross body, the breath is subtle too. But breath is something we feel. Breath is definitely more sthula, more gross, more tangible than prana. So again, that's another example of we are trying to control our breath, and through controlling the breath, because the breath is one of the manifestations of prana, because the breath and prana are connected, not exactly identical, but connected. So by controlling my breath, I'm indirectly trying to control the prana. So the two are not identical, but they are very much related. What is the purpose of understanding the elemental composition of the body if the purpose is to become free of body identification? Yes, that's true. We don't have to become experts to know exactly what the chemical composition of the body is, but it's enough for us to know that the body is made up of these elemental particles, and because it is made up of these particles, it is composed of these particles, that which is composed will eventually decompose. So every composition presupposes a certain future decomposition. So that's it. If we remember that, that should be more than enough. In the movie Mangalam, fuel is given to satellite and it moves a little out of Earth's sphere and eventually it leaves the Earth's sphere free to its destination. I feel that little by little will we eventually be free. Is that a good analogy to stay hopeful? Yes, it's possible to see that freedom can be gradual. One thing that we can see is that people who are artistic, or people who are, and I'm not just saying just a general interest in art, but people who have truly find any kind of an art, any kind of an intellectual or artistic pursuit, if that's what I find meaningful, if that's what gives me great joy, then to that extent, my consciousness has moved from the body. It's not that I have become free from the body consciousness, but there are other things besides the demands of the body that I'm able to invest my time and energy into it. And to that extent, I have become free from the stranglehold that the body has upon us. We read in the lives of great scientists or great artists, when they are engaged in their pursuits, sometimes they have forgotten to have their meal. Sometimes they don't need to sleep. Astronomers, if they are tracking a certain planet or seeing the movement in a certain galaxy, sometimes they can spend entire night looking through their telescopes and not even think that they need to go and sleep now. So, and to that extent, these people have become free from just these very basic demands that the body has in terms of hunger, thirst, and sleep, and so on. So yes, it's possible to see freedom being gradually attained when we move from the gross, the basic needs for survival to something which is more higher, more subtle. So it's possible to look at it that way, yes. Om Jananim Saradam Devim Ramakrishnam Jagadgurum Padapadme Tayo Shritva Pranamami Muhur Muhu.